Picture this: the flicker of candlelight dancing across wooden beams, the low murmur of voices mingling with the clink of tankards, and in the center of it all, a lone figure commanding the room with nothing but the power of their words. This was the magic of the medieval tavern, where storytellers weren't just entertainers, they were keepers of history, weavers of dreams, and the beating heart of community. Long before streaming services or even printed books, these tales spun in smoky corners were how people made sense of the world, passing down everything from heroic legends to cautionary fables. And here's the astonishing part: though centuries have passed, the art of tavern storytelling didn't vanish. It evolved, embedding itself into the way we share stories today, from campfire ghost tales to binge-worthy TV dramas. What made these medieval storytellers so unforgettable? It wasn't just the stories themselves, though those were thrilling enough, filled with knights, dragons, and cunning tricksters, but the way they were told. These bards mastered something timeless: the ability to make listeners lean in, to feel the chill of a winter's night or the heat of a dragon's breath as if they were living it. Taverns became stages where ordinary people could escape their daily struggles, if only for an evening, through the shared experience of a well-told tale. And this tradition did more than entertain, it bound communities together, preserving history and morals in a world where few could read or write. Now, fast forward to today. You might think we've left those tavern tales behind, but look closer. The essence of medieval storytelling lives on in everything from podcasters holding audiences spellbound with true crime narratives to video game lore that feels as rich as any epic poem. The tools have changed, but the human craving for connection, for stories that make us feel part of something bigger, remains the same. So let's step into that smoky tavern together, traveling back to uncover the secrets of these ancient storytellers and discovering why, even now, their legacy whispers in every great story we love. This isn't just history, it's the hidden thread that still ties us to the past, proving that a well-spun tale is truly timeless. To understand why taverns became the beating heart of storytelling, we have to step into the rhythm of medieval life. Imagine a world without newspapers, social media, or even reliable roads connecting towns where information traveled as slowly as a horse could trot. In that world, taverns weren't just buildings, they were lifelines. A merchant fresh from Paris might bring rumors of wars brewing beyond the mountains. A wandering minstrel could spin a tale so vivid it made farmers forget their aching backs. Even the local blacksmith, leaning against the bar, might share a ghost story passed down through generations, his voice dropping to a whisper as the firelight flickered. These spaces thrived on something deeper than ale. They offered a rare equality. Nobles might have their grand halls, but in the tavern, a peasant could sit elbow to elbow with a traveling scholar, both equally captivated by the same story. That's where the magic happened. Stories here weren't just told, they were lived. A bard's ballad about a knight's betrayal might spark debates about justice. A fable about a clever fox could become an inside joke for weeks. And because most people couldn't read, these oral tales weren't entertainment. They were how lessons, history, and even rebellions were quietly spread. Think of it like the medieval version of a trending hashtag. When a storyteller recounted a heroic stand against tyranny, it wasn't just a plot, it was a spark. Tales of Robin Hood stealing from the rich didn't just amuse, they gave hope to the poor. The tavern's loose, rowdy atmosphere allowed ideas to circulate in ways they never could in a church or lord's court. No wonder authorities sometimes eyed these places with suspicion. Words here had power. Yet taverns also balanced that edge with warmth. In winters, when villages were isolated by snow, the shared heat of bodies and stories turned strangers into neighbors. A traveling storyteller might arrive with news that a distant plague had ended, lifting the room's spirits, or a regular, known for his comedic timing, could turn a mundane local scandal into a riotous satire that had everyone howling. This wasn't just fun, it was survival. Laughter and camaraderie eased the hardships of famine, war, and disease. And here's the thread that ties those smoky rooms to today. Taverns mastered the art of immersive storytelling. Modern podcasts, with their intimate, conversational style, that's the descendant of a bard leaning close to his audience, adjusting his tale based on their gasps or sighs. Video games with sprawling lore, they're the digital equivalent of a saga that grew richer each time it was retold, with listeners adding their own twists. Even the way we binge-watch shows, craving that collective, water-cooler moment where everyone discusses the plot, that's the same human urge that once had villagers dissecting a storyteller's cliffhanger for days. The medieval tavern proved something timeless. Stories don't just need tellers, they need listeners breathing, reacting, reshaping them together. That's why, centuries later, we still seek places real or virtual where stories aren't just consumed but shared. The tavern may have traded its wooden stools for coffee shop couches or Twitter threads, but the alchemy remains. When people gather and a voice begins to spin a tale, the ordinary world falls away. Just like it did under those candlelit beams, the storytellers who brought medieval taverns to life were as diverse as the tales they spun. Some were trained professionals, bards who traveled from town to town with instruments slung over their shoulders, trading songs and sagas for a hot meal or a bed in the stable. Others were local figures, a retired soldier with a knack for embellishing his wartime exploits, or a merchant who'd picked up gossip from distant cities and repackaged it as thrilling adventure. What united them wasn't their background, but their mastery of something far more precious: the ability to turn words into worlds. Take the minstrels, for example. These weren't just musicians, they were one-person theaters. A skilled minstrel could mimic the clash of swords with a drum, impersonate a love-struck maiden with a falsetto, and have the whole room holding their breath as he whispered the villain's monologue. Their performances were immersive, almost cinematic, blending poetry, melody, and theatrics in a way that felt revolutionary for the time. And like modern stand-up comedians, they knew how to read a crowd. A bawdy joke that killed in a bustling port town might flop in a pious village, so adaptability was key. Then there were the everyday storytellers, the farmers, blacksmiths, or washerwomen who might not have had formal training but possessed something just as vital: authenticity. Their tales often drew from local history or folklore, grounding even the wildest fables in a shared reality. A story about a haunted forest became twice as terrifying when the teller pointed to the woods just beyond the village. These amateur raconteurs were the keepers of communal memory, turning personal experiences into collective legend. What's fascinating is how these narrators blurred the line between fact and fiction. A bard might weave real battles into his epic, changing details to flatter the local lord, or to avoid angering him. Gossip about a scandalous affair could morph into a cautionary fable by the time it reached the next town. This wasn't deception, it was survival. Storytellers were cultural chameleons, tailoring their material to fit their audience's fears, hopes, and sense of identity. And just like today's social media influencers, the best ones cultivated a brand. A minstrel known for ghost stories might be invited to castles to entertain nobles on stormy nights. A bard with a repertoire of heroic ballads could find steady work at festivals, Reputation mattered. A dull storyteller might get booed out of the tavern, while a brilliant one could earn free ale for weeks. The stakes were high, but so were the rewards, not just in coin, but in status. To hold a room spellbound was to wield a quiet kind of power. Yet, unlike modern celebrities, these storytellers were deeply rooted in community. Their survival depended on reciprocity. A tale well told might earn them a place at the hearth, but they also had to listen, collecting new stories, jokes, and rumors to replenish their arsenal. It was a constant exchange, a living library of oral tradition. That's why the best stories survived, not because they were written down, but because they were retold, reshaped, and relearned by generations of voices in dimly lit rooms. This fluidity gave medieval storytelling its enduring magic. A single legend like King Arthur might have 100 variations, each reflecting the values of the people telling it. A story wasn't a fixed artifact, it was a living thing growing richer with every retelling. That's a legacy we've inherited more than we realize. When we binge a Netflix series or dissect a viral tweet, we're part of the same ancient tradition shaping narratives together, one tavern or screen at a time. Those medieval tavern tales weren't just random entertainment. They were a tapestry woven from the very fabric of everyday life, stitching together the extraordinary and the ordinary. Picture a room hushed as a storyteller begins a saga about a knight battling a dragon. On the surface, it's pure adventure, but dig deeper and you'll find layers of meaning. That dragon wasn't just a monster. It symbolized the chaos lurking beyond the village walls, the plague, the bandits, the unknown. And the knight, he embodied the hope that courage and virtue could conquer even the darkest threats. These stories gave people a way to grapple with fears too big to name, transforming them into something manageable, even thrilling. But not all tales were so grand. Some of the most beloved were downright cheeky, bawdy jokes about clever peasants outwitting pompous lords, or romantic misadventures that had the whole tavern roaring with laughter. Humor was a survival tool, a way to poke fun at the rigid social order without outright rebellion. A well-told joke about a greedy priest or a foolish nobleman let villagers vent their frustrations safely, wrapped in the guise of entertainment. And just like today's memes, the best ones spread like wildfire, evolving with each retelling. Then there were the ghost stories, told in flickering firelight to send shivers down spines. These weren't just cheap thrills, they were lessons in disguise. A tale about a vengeful spirit haunting a dishonest merchant reinforced community values: cheat your neighbors, and you might not sleep peacefully again. Even the silliest seeming fables, like talking animals or magical wishes gone wrong, carried sharp moral edges. They taught children and adults alike about consequences, wrapped in packages so engaging no one felt lectured. What's striking is how these themes mirrored the duality of medieval life. For every story of chivalric love, there was one about betrayal. For every heroic quest, a warning about hubris. The tavern was where people could explore life's contradictions safely through the lens of fiction. A peasant who'd never hold a sword could imagine himself a knight for an evening. A woman trapped in a rigid social role could lose herself in a tale of a witch who wielded power on her own terms. These stories weren't escapes from reality, they were tools to navigate it. And that's why they've endured. Strip away the dragons and the castles, and you'll find the same human struggles we wrestle with today, the knight's quest for honor. That's our modern hero's journey in a blockbuster film. The cautionary fable about greed, it's the plot of every financial crime documentary. Even the raunchy tavern jokes have their descendants in sitcoms and stand-up routines. The settings change, but the stories, the ones that make us laugh, gasp, or think, remain timeless. They're proof that the human heart, no matter the century, beats to the same rhythms of hope, fear, and the irresistible pull of a well-told tale. Imagine trying to preserve an entire culture's stories without a single page of paper or pixel on a screen. That was the reality for medieval storytellers who carried entire epics in their minds like living libraries. Unlike modern books or films where every word is locked in place, these oral tales were fluid, shaped by the teller's voice, the audience's reactions, even the mood of the room. A hero's fate might change depending on whether the crowd cheered or gasped. A villain's backstory could grow darker if told during a famine. This wasn't inconsistency, it was collaboration, with each retelling refining the story like a river smoothing a stone. The beauty of oral tradition lay in its adaptability. A minstrel traveling from France to Germany might tweak a tale to reflect local customs, swapping a French vineyard for a German alehouse to make it resonate. Historical events bled into legends. A real flood became a dragon's wrath. A popular uprising morphed into a fable about unity. Stories weren't static artifacts but living things, evolving to meet the fears and hopes of each new generation. Compare that to today's rigid copyright laws, where altering a single line of a novel could spark lawsuits. Back then, creativity thrived precisely because no one owned the plot. Yet this fluidity came with risks. Without written records, stories could vanish overnight. A master storyteller's death might take irreplaceable tales to the grave. Natural disasters, wars, or simply the passage of time could erase centuries of oral history in a blink. That's why the best storytellers trained apprentices, passing down techniques as carefully as recipes for immortality. They understood their role as human hard drives, preserving not just entertainment but identity, the collective memory of people who left no diaries or manifestos behind. The contrast with written records is striking. Once a story was inked onto parchment, it gained permanence but lost flexibility. A scribe's version of King Arthur became the version, freezing the tale in time. Writing brought precision, yes, but also a kind of rigidity oral storytellers would have found baffling. Imagine a bard being scolded for getting the words wrong, when the very magic of performance lay in making the story breathe anew each night. Still, oral and written traditions weren't rivals, they fed each other. Monks transcribed folk tales into manuscripts, adding moral lessons to please the church. Later, printed books borrowed the punchy rhythms of tavern storytelling, crafting dialogue that felt alive. Even today, you can spot oral tradition's fingerprints in our most beloved stories. Ever notice how fairy tales repeat phrases like "once upon a time" or "the end"? Those were memory aids, rhythmic hooks to help tellers recall what came next. Podcasters and TED Talk speakers still use similar tricks, proving that ancient techniques never really die, they just find new microphones. What's remarkable is how this tension between fluidity and permanence still shapes storytelling. Think of fan fiction, where enthusiasts rewrite their favorite book characters, or meme culture, where a single image mutates into countless variants. We're still that medieval crowd, leaning in to hear a familiar tale told in a fresh way. Only now, our tavern is the internet, and our minstrels have Wi-Fi. The tools have changed, but the human longing to reshape stories in our own image, that's as old as firelight and a willing audience. The difference between a forgettable tale and one that clung to the audience's bones for decades came down to performance. A medieval storyteller wasn't a passive narrator, they were an actor, a musician, a conjurer of worlds. Every muscle played a part. A raised eyebrow could turn a simple line into sly satire. A sudden drop to a whisper forced listeners to lean in, their own breath catching as if they'd stumbled upon a secret. And when the bard's voice swelled to mimic a thunderstorm or crumbled into the rasp of a dying king, the room didn't just hear the story, they felt it in their marrow. Consider the tools they wielded. A single wooden staff struck against the floor could become the galloping hooves of a knight's charger. A tankard slammed onto a table transformed into a dungeon door slamming shut. Even silence was a weapon. Pauses stretched just long enough to make the audience squirm before delivering the punchline or the plunge of a dagger. These weren't gimmicks, they were survival skills. In a world without special effects or even consistent lighting, the storyteller's body was the special effect. Vocal versatility was their superpower. A skilled performer might cycle through a dozen voices in one tale: the growl of a troll, the simpering whine of a cowardly squire, the honeyed lies of a temptress. They didn't just describe characters, they became them, shifting posture and tone so completely that listeners could swear multiple people stood before them. And the best ones had an instinct for rhythm, letting sentences roll like waves, building to a crest of excitement before easing back, giving the audience just enough respite to crave the next surge. Audience participation cranked the immersion even higher. Unlike today's passive moviegoers, medieval listeners were often pulled into the action. A storyteller might point to a wide-eyed child and declare them the brave peasant who'd distract the dragon. The crowd would chant refrains or stamp their feet to mimic an approaching army. This wasn't just fun, it forged a pact between teller and listener. The story didn't happen to the bard, it happened to everyone in the room. Modern storytellers still use these tricks, even if they've swapped tankards for TD talks. The way a comedian times a punchline, that's the descendant of a tavern jester's perfect pause. Asthma creators who whisper into microphones, they're tapping into the same primal response that made villagers shiver when a bard hissed a ghost story. Even virtual reality, with its promise of total immersion, strives to recreate what medieval performers achieved with nothing but their bodies and the willing imagination of a crowd. The lesson here isn't about nostalgia, it's about human wiring. We haven't outgrown the need for performance, we've just digitized it. A TikTok storyteller using dramatic zooms and sound effects is playing the same ancient game as the minstrel who made children duck when he mimed swinging a sword. The tools evolve, but the magic stays the same. When a teller commits fully voice, body, and soul, the audience doesn't just listen, they surrender. And that surrender is why, centuries later, we still crave stories that don't just speak to us, but leap off the screen or the tavern stool and grab us by the throat. Music wasn't just decoration in those smoky taverns. It was the invisible hand shaping every gasp, every tear, every burst of laughter. Picture a minstrel's fingers plucking a lute's strings as he begins a tragic ballad. The melody starts slow and mournful, mirroring the weight of a knight's doomed love affair. Then, as the tale twists toward betrayal, the tempo quickens, strings snapping like fraying trust. The music isn't merely playing alongside the story. It's breathing life into it, guiding the audience's emotions as deftly as the words themselves. These musicians understood something primal. Melody bypasses the intellect and goes straight to the gut. A cheerful tune could turn a simple fable about a clever fox into a riotous comedy, while a single, sustained note on a harp might freeze the room when the hero steps into a dragon's lair. Instruments became extensions of the storyteller's voice. A drum's thunder mimicked an approaching army. A flute's trill became the laughter of a mischievous fairy. Even the tuning of strings wasn't arbitrary. A minstrel might detune his lute slightly for a ghost story, creating an eerie dissonance that raised goosebumps before the first word was spoken. The practical magic of music went deeper than atmosphere. For epic tales spanning hours or even days, think Beowulf or the Song of Roland, melodies acted as mental bookmarks. Repeating refrains helped listeners track complex plots like chapter headings in an audiobook. A hero's theme might recur each time he triumphed, while a villain's leitmotif warned of danger before the narrator spoke their name. This wasn't just artistry, it was neuroscience before the term existed. Rhythm and rhyme cemented stories in memory, which is why centuries later, scholars still find fragments of medieval ballads preserved in folk songs, their narratives intact despite wars and time. But perhaps the most fascinating power of tavern music was its ability to dissolve barriers. A nobleman might sneer at a peasant's dialect, but a well-played harp could unite them in shared sorrow during a lament. Drinking songs turned strangers into comrades, their voices joining in choruses that echoed into the night. Even language differences blurred when melodies carried the emotion a traveler from distant lands might not grasp every word, but the tremble of a fiddle during a tale of lost love needed no translation. This synergy of music and narrative never truly faded. Modern film scores owe everything to those minstrels, using swelling violins to signal triumph or pulsing synths to build tension. Video game soundtracks adapt dynamically to players' choices, much like a medieval bard adjusting his tune to the crowd's mood. Even podcasters today layer ambient sounds beneath their stories, instinctively knowing what tavern tellers mastered long ago. The right music doesn't just support a tale, it becomes the air the story breathes. So next time you lose yourself in a movie's climax or hum along to a catchy commercial jingle, remember, you're part of a tradition that once thrived in candlelit rooms, where every note was a thread in the tapestry of tales spinning, and every silence between them held the promise of what came next. Those tavern tales spinning through the smoky air did far more than pass the time. They were the glue holding communities together in a fractured world. In an era when laws were written in Latin and news traveled at the speed of a horse's gallop, stories became the people's library, courtroom, and town square all in one. Take the humble fable about a greedy wolf outwitted by a clever rabbit. On the surface, it's a simple children's tale, but beneath that, it's a survival manual for the powerless. Peasants living under the thumb of ruthless lords could cheer for that rabbit and silently think, maybe we could do that too. Stories gave them a language to critique power without risking the gallows, a wink wrapped in a metaphor. Shared narratives also forged identity in ways we've since outsourced to textbooks and social media feeds. When a traveling bard recounted the epic of a local hero who defended the region centuries prior, he wasn't just reciting history, he was reminding villagers of who they were. The details might blur over time. The hero's sword grew longer, the enemy's forces swelled, but the core message stuck. We are people who endure. In a world where most would never venture beyond their birthplace, these stories stitched together a sense of belonging that transcended the dirt floors of the tavern. And then there were the stories too dangerous to tell plainly. A ballad about a star-crossed lover's suicide might really be a commentary on feudal marriage laws. A ghost story set in a corrupt monastery could vent frustrations with the church without uttering heresy. Taverns became sanctuaries for this coded speech, where the right tale told at the right moment could spark everything from gossip to quiet resistance. Historians even trace some peasant revolts back to seditious folktales that spread like embers from hearth to hearth. Yet for all their subversive potential, most tales served a subtler, deeper purpose. They taught people how to live. A knight's quest wasn't just adventure, it modeled perseverance. A witch's curse illustrated the cost of vengeance. Even the raunchiest jokes carried lessons about trust, folly, or the absurdity of rigid class divides. Unlike sermons delivered from a pulpit, these lessons snuck in under the guise of entertainment, bypassing skepticism the way a parent hides medicine in honey. The brilliance of this system lay in its reciprocity. Unlike today's one-way streaming culture where stories are consumed passively, medieval taverns thrived on call and response. A teller might adapt a story based on who groaned at the villain's cruelty or cheered for the underdog. Over time, collective reactions refined tales into cultural mirrors, reflecting what audiences valued or feared most. That's why the same core stories appear across continents with local flavors. They weren't just told. They were lived by each community that retold them. Fast forward to today, and you'll spot these ancient functions hiding in plain sight. Ever noticed how true crime podcasts dissect societal fears under the guise of entertainment? Or how viral memes critique politics through humor, just like those medieval jests about nobles? Our platforms have changed, but the human need to bond, debate, and make sense of chaos through stories remains unshaken. The tavern may have traded its timber walls for digital ones, but when we lean closer to our screens, laughing or shivering at a shared narrative, we're still part of that unbroken chain, passing down the oldest magic we know, the spell of a story that makes strangers feel like kin. Imagine a storyteller in the middle of a packed tavern, spinning a tale about a daring thief when suddenly a drunk farmer shouts, "Make him steal the baron's prize goat instead." The room erupts in laughter, and without missing a beat, the storyteller weaves the goat into the plot. This wasn't a disruption, it was the lifeblood of medieval storytelling. Unlike today's rigid scripts where audiences sit silently in dark theaters, tavern tales thrived on chaos. Listeners weren't just spectators, they were co-creators, shaping stories in real time with their cheers, groans, or even the occasional rotten vegetable hurled at the stage. This interactivity transformed every performance into a high-wire act. A skilled storyteller could read a room like a map, pivoting based on the crowd's energy. Children begging for more dragon fights, the night's battle suddenly gained epic new details, a table of merchants rolling their eyes at yet another damsel in distress. Enter a cunning merchant's daughter who outsmarted the villain herself. Adaptability wasn't just a skill, it was survival. Bore your audience and you'd lose your supper, literally. But win them over and you'd have them hanging on every word, feeding you twists to keep the story alive. The magic lay in the give and take. Some bards even planted ringers in the crowd friends who'd shout requests to steer the tale toward crowd-pleasing moments. Others used call and response chants, turning the room into a chorus. And what did the wolf say? "Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin." This wasn't just fun, it forged a bond between teller and listener. When villagers felt they'd helped craft the story, it became theirs, passed down with pride, like a recipe improved by each cook's hands. Compare that to modern entertainment, where algorithms dictate what we watch, and scripts are locked months before filming. Medieval storytelling was live, collaborative, and deliciously unpredictable, more like a video game with endless branching paths than a linear movie. Yet traces of that spontaneity survive. Ever been to an improv comedy show where performers build scenes from audience suggestions? That's the tavern spirit in a blazer and jeans. Even interactive theater, where crowds vote on plot twists, echoes the rowdy democracy of those ale-stained benches. But here's what we've lost: the raw intimacy of stories shaped by collective breath. When a medieval crowd gasped as one, or fell silent at a tragic turn, their reactions changed the tale. A storyteller might stretch a lover's reunion because the room sighed at their parting, or cut a villain's monologue short if booze grew too loud. The story didn't exist apart from the audience, it lived through them. Today's binge-watching culture, where we consume stories alone in glow-lit silence, might crave that very thing without knowing it. Why else do we pause Netflix to argue with characters or flood social media with theories? We're still reaching for that ancient tavern bench, hungry to whisper our own twist into the tale. The stories that survived the centuries weren't just lucky, they were fighters, clawing their way through time by sheer emotional grip. Think of medieval taverns as Darwinian labs for folklore, where tales either adapted or went extinct. A story about a bland knight who always won, forgotten by sunrise, but a tragedy where love and betrayal twisted like vines. That one clung to memory, passed from lips to ears across generations. The secret wasn't just excitement, it was resonance. The best tales mirrored universal human aches, the sting of injustice, the giddiness of first love, the terror of loss. And because these emotions transcend time, the stories carrying them became immortal. Take Beowulf, a monster-slaying epic that could have easily devolved into a repetitive hack and slash. What saved it from oblivion wasn't Grendel's claws, but the hero's haunting mortality. When Beowulf, old and weary, faces his final dragon, the tale shifts from brute strength to something deeper, the fragility of glory. That twist, that heart, made it unforgettable. Meanwhile, countless lesser sagas vanished because they offered spectacle without soul. The tavern's role in this natural selection was brutal but brilliant. Unlike royal courts, where flattery might keep a dull story alive, the common crowd had no patience for mediocrity. A tale that failed to captivate wouldn't just be ignored, it'd be drowned out by clanking tankards and side conversations. Tellers learned fast: trim the tedious bits, amp up the tension, or find yourself performing to empty benches. This merciless feedback loop polished rough stories into gems. And the winners, they shared a few ruthless traits. First, simplicity. The core of Cinderella cruelty overcome by kindness fits in a sentence, making it easy to retell. But also flexibility. A story about a clever fox could be set in France or Persia, with details tailored to local fauna and fears. The most enduring tales were like skeletons, strong enough to stand, but with room for each culture to add its own flesh. What's astonishing is how these ancient survival tactics still govern storytelling today. Hollywood blockbusters test screen endings, axing what doesn't thrill focus groups, just like tavern crowds voting with their attention. Viral memes mutate to stay relevant, shedding unshared versions. Even bedtime stories evolve. Modern parents might swap a dragon for a spaceship, but the bones of bravery and curiosity remain unchanged. The medieval tavern proved a story's true test isn't parchment or pixels. It's the human pulse quickening in the dark, generation after generation, as the tale begins anew. The smoky tavern was never the final stop for these stories. They were too restless, too alive to stay in one place. Like seeds carried on the wind, the techniques perfected in those dim rooms took root wherever people gathered to share warmth and wonder. Picture a band of travelers huddled around a campfire, flames casting shadows as a merchant recounts his narrow escape from bandits. His voice dips and soars just like the tavern bards, his hands painting the scene in the air. Or imagine a bustling marketplace where a fruit seller spices up her pitch with a folk tale about enchanted apples, drawing customers closer. Even royal courts, with their silk tapestries and silver goblets, couldn't resist the pull of a well-told story. Though the minstrels there might swap raucous jokes for polished allegories flattering the king's lineage. What made these stories so portable wasn't just their content, but their craft. The same tricks that held a drunk farmer's attention at midnight, the pregnant pauses, the sudden shouts, the mimicry of clashing swords, worked just as well under an open sky or a vaulted ceiling. A skilled teller could stretch a 5-minute anecdote into an hour-long epic or trim a saga to fit the time it took to roast a rabbit, all without losing the thread. This flexibility turned storytelling into a survival skill, as practical as knowing how to start a fire or mend a cloak. A wandering monk might trade tales for shelter. A soldier could ease tensions around a campfire with a well-placed joke. Stories became currency, comfort, and camouflage, adapting to every environment they touched, and adapt they did. The bawdy tavern tale about a cheating wife might become a cautionary fable in a monastery, warning of temptation's dangers. A ghost story that thrilled villagers could be polished into a courtly romance, with the vengeful spirit recast as a lovelorn noblewoman. The core emotions stayed the same: fear, hope, laughter, but the wrapping changed to suit the audience. This chameleon quality ensured storytelling survival far beyond the Middle Ages. When printing presses arrived, these oral traditions didn't vanish. They seeped into chapbooks and plays, their rhythms echoing in Shakespeare's crowd-pleasing monologues. You can still trace the tavern's legacy in the unlikeliest places. Modern stand-up comedians pacing the stage, modulating their tone to ride the crowd's laughter. That's the descendant of a medieval jester reading the room. Podcasters who weave personal anecdotes into broader themes. They're tapping into the same intimate cadence that once held listeners spellbound over ale. Even the way we binge-watch TV shows, craving that collective gasp when a plot twists, ties back to the communal thrill of a story unfolding in real time. The venues have changed, from campfires to cinemas, market squares to TikTok, but the human hunger for connection through stories remains unshaken. Perhaps that's the greatest testament to these medieval storytellers. They understood that a tale isn't just about what happens, but how it's shared. The tavern taught them that stories thrive in the space between teller and listener, in the nods and gasps and interruptions that shape the telling. Whether whispered in a castle corridor or shouted over a crackling fire, the best stories never truly end. They simply find new ears, new voices, and new places to call home. Listen to the cadence of your favorite podcast host, the way their voice drops to a whisper during a suspenseful moment, or how they pause just long enough to let a punchline land. That's not modern technique, that's ancient muscle memory. The DNA of medieval tavern storytelling pulses through today's most compelling narratives. Whether it's a comedian reading a crowd's energy or a TD speaker weaving personal anecdotes into a universal lesson. The tools have upgraded microphones instead of lute strings, streaming algorithms instead of wandering minstrels, but the core blueprint remains startlingly unchanged. Take stand-up comedy, for instance. A medieval jester mocking the nobility and a modern comic roasting politicians are kin beneath the surface. Both rely on timing, audience rapport, and the delicate art of saying just enough to provoke laughter without crossing into danger. Watch a seasoned comic adjust their set on the fly, scrapping jokes that bomb and doubling down on what makes the room erupt. That's the same survival instinct that once guided tavern bards trimming tedious subplots when tankards started clinking. Even the structure mirrors ancient patterns. Setups and payoffs today are just streamlined versions of the classic rule of three, used in fables where repetition builds to a twist. Podcasts, though, might be the purest heirs to the tavern's legacy. The intimacy of a host speaking directly into your ears, as if sharing secrets over a drink, replicates the hush of a fireside tale. Serialized true crime, that's the descendant of a bard spinning a multi-night saga about a notorious outlaw, doling out cliffhangers to ensure listeners return. The conversational tone, the ad-libs, the way hosts often react to their own stories, these aren't innovations. They're revivals. Medieval storytellers knew listeners craved the illusion of spontaneity, even if the tale was rehearsed 100 times. And then there's the TD talk, the modern equivalent of a scholar captivating a room without putting them to sleep. The best ones don't lecture, they storytell. A speaker might open with a childhood memory, using it as a hook to explore neuroscience, just as a medieval monk might have sugar-coated a sermon with a parable about a mischievous devil. The techniques overlap strikingly. personal vulnerability to build trust, vivid metaphors to simplify complexity, and a rhythmic delivery that feels more like music than speech. Even the 18-minute time limit echoes Tavern traditions, where attention spans were measured in ale sips. What's truly remarkable is how these ancient strategies thrive in digital spaces designed for distraction. A viral TikTok story succeeds through the same principles that once held a tavern wrapped: immediate hooks, emotional authenticity, and a payoff compact enough to fit between scrolls. Livestream gamers narrate their adventures with the same breathless excitement as a bard describing a dragon fight. Even corporate branding leans on archetypes straight out of medieval folklore: the rebel, the mentor, the trickster, because they tap into instincts older than ink. Yet the deepest thread connecting past and present isn't technique, it's hunger. Humans still crave that alchemy of voice, rhythm, and shared experience that turns words into worlds. When a podcast host gasps, "Wait for it," or a comic holds a pause just a beat too long, they're tapping into a primal contract between teller and listener, one forged in firelight centuries ago. The tavern may have traded its timber for fiber optics, but the magic lives where it always has, in the space between a story well told and an audience leaning closer, ready to be swept away. Walk into any bustling pub tonight, and you'll witness something remarkable: not just clinking glasses, but the age-old dance of storytelling in its purest form. That group in the corner howling over a friend's disastrous first date, they're part of an unbroken chain stretching back to those medieval taverns, the bartender recounting the time a celebrity stumbled in after hours. He's inheriting the mantle of bards who once spun yarns for their supper. Even in our hyper-digital age, where stories flash across screens in seconds, there's something primal about gathering in dim light to trade tales mouth to ear, laughter rippling through the room like firelight. What's fascinating is how little the core ingredients have changed. Just like their medieval counterparts, modern pub stories thrive on performance. Watch how the teller leans in, miming the moment their car skidded on ice, or how the room falls silent when someone drops their voice to confess. And that's when I saw the ghost. Hands gesture, accents shift, pauses stretch, techniques a 14th century minstrel would recognize instantly. The best stories here aren't just told, they're embodied, turning ordinary events into epics with the alchemy of delivery. Pubs also preserve that sacred tavern balance between ritual and spontaneity. Certain stories become legends retold every Friday. Remember when Dave tried to ride the pub's beer keg? Each retelling adding fresh embellishments, like a game of telephone across years. Yet there's always room for new tales to erupt, sparked by a stranger's odd tattoo or the thunderstorm rattling the windows. Unlike scripted TV or social media posts, these stories breathe, mutate, and sometimes collapse in glorious failure when the teller loses the thread amid heckling. And that's part of the charm. Technology hasn't killed oral tradition, it's just given it new shadows to play in. That group filming a friend's hilarious drunken toast. They're capturing a moment meant to be retold, not just online, but later, over another round. The pub quiz host weaving local gossip into questions keeps the communal narrative alive. Even the loner scrolling their phone might be mining it for a story to share, because humans still crave that visceral reward, the widened eyes, the collective gasp, the "no way." That means you've hooked them. This isn't nostalgia, it's neuroscience. Studies show our brains sync up during live storytelling, releasing oxytocin that fosters trust and connection. Medieval villagers knew this instinctively when they bonded over tales of crop failures or miracles. Today's pub goers might dissect football matches or celebrity scandals, but the underlying impulse is identical: to make sense of life's chaos together, one story at a time. The next time you find yourself in a pub, listen past the music and chatter. Beneath the modern veneer, you'll hear the echoes of those ancient taverns, where every stool holds a potential storyteller, every laugh renews an ancient contract, and the oldest algorithm still rules. Lean in close, speak from the gut, and let the tale take flight. Think about the last time you lost yourself in a YouTube rabbit hole, one video leading to another until hours melted away. That hypnotic pull isn't so different from the spell a medieval storyteller cast over a tavern crowd. Only now, instead of flickering candlelight, we've got glowing screens, and the wooden benches have morphed into comment sections buzzing in dozens of languages. The platforms have changed, but the essence remains, a human voice sharing something that makes us lean closer, forget our worries, and crave the next turn in the tale. What makes a TikTok trend go viral or a podcast episode rack up millions of downloads? The same alchemy that once packed taverns to the rafters. Take engagement, those quick cuts in a lifestyle vlog that match the rhythm of a caffeine rush. That's the digital equivalent of a bard slamming his staff to mimic a galloping horse. The way asthma creators whisper into microphones, making millions shiver with just their breath. That's the old trick of dropping one's voice to a hush so the crowd inches forward. Even the comments shouting, "Pav, you're the dragon in this story," prove audiences still crave participation, just like villagers heckling a minstrel to change the plot. Emotion, though, is the true bridge across centuries. A medieval mother might have calmed her child with a fable about a clever mouse outsmarting a cat. Today, an animator distills that same comfort into a 30-second cartoon shared across continents. The tools are slicker, high-definition tears instead of a bard's quavering voice, but the goal is identical, to make strangers feel together. When a true crime podcaster reveals a twist, the collective gasp is no different from the one that once echoed off tavern walls. Yet the greatest parallel lies in adaptability. Just as a wandering minstrel tweaked tales for each new crowd, digital creators morph content to ride algorithms. A cooking channel might pivot from quiet baking tutorials to frenetic 5-second recipes, because that's what grabs eyeballs now. Live streamers read real-time chat like medieval performers, gauging rowdy audiences, switching jokes mid-sentence if the vibe shifts. Even the way TikTok stitches React clips mirrors tavern call and response, each creator adding their verse to an ever-growing ballad. The real magic, while medieval storytellers were limited by geography, today's voices leap borders effortlessly. A grandma in Mumbai shares folktales on Instagram Reels. A gamer in Brazil narrates his quests like a modern-day Beowulf. The tavern's walls have vanished, but the firelight remains in the glow of phones held close under blankets, in the laughter of co-workers passing a viral video around. The stories still find us just as they always have, because no matter how flashy the stage, humanity's oldest app never needs an update. The hunger to be swept away together by words that feel like a secret shared just with you. Our brains don't just enjoy stories, they crave them, lighting up like festival lanterns when a tale takes hold. Neuroscientists have found that when we hear a compelling narrative, our neural activity mirrors the storyteller's words as if we're living the events ourselves. Describe a knight gripping his sword, and the motor cortex of listeners twitches, priming for battle. Whisper about a crackling fire, and their sensory cortex hums with imagined warmth. This isn't passive listening, it's full body immersion, a biological dance perfected over millennia. Medieval bards didn't need fMRI scans to know this. They understood that a well-told story could make a farmer's palms sweat or a child's eyes widen, because they felt the room shift with every whispered twist. What's truly remarkable is how stories bypass logic to speak directly to our emotions. A dry list of facts about famine might make a villager nod, but a tragic ballad about a mother sharing her last loaf with a starving stranger. That lodges in the heart. Studies show narratives trigger oxytocin release, the trust hormone, making us more empathetic to characters, even fictional ones. That's why tavern tales about injustice stirred crowds to action far more effectively than sermons. Our brains treat vivid stories like lived experience, wiring their lessons into memory with neon clarity. The peasant who couldn't recite a single Bible verse might remember every word of the parable about the greedy miller who lost everything because it felt true. Conflict is the engine that makes this magic work. From Beowulf's battles to today's courtroom dramas, our brains cling to tension like climbers gripping a rope. Medieval storytellers mastered this, dangling listeners over cliffs, literal and metaphorical, before yanking them to safety. Neuroscientists explain why unresolved stories create a Zeigarnik effect, leaving our brains itching for closure. That tavern crowd begging for the next installment of a serialized saga. They were chasing the same dopamine hit we get binge watching a thriller. A cliffhanger isn't just entertainment. It's neurological warfare, and the bards waged it brilliantly. But stories aren't just mental sparklers, they're survival tools. Before GPS or Google, oral tales carried life-saving knowledge. A fable about children lured by candy into a witch's hut taught stranger danger. Epic poems encoded navigation tricks. When the oak splits northward, fresh water lies beyond. Even humor had purpose. Laughing at a fool who ignored weather signs reinforced practical wisdom. Our ancestors didn't just recount events, they distilled them into narrative vitamins, easy to swallow and impossible to forget. This primal wiring explains why storytelling refuses to die, no matter how flashy our tech becomes. A TikTok trend might replace a minstrel's lute, but the cravings it feeds for connection, meaning, catharsis are ancient as campfire smoke. When a medieval mother soothed her child with a tale of brave mouse, and when a modern parent reads Good Night Moon, they're tapping the same instinct to comfort through narrative's alchemy. We haven't outgrown stories, we've just given them new costumes. The tavern's torch has passed to screens, but the light it casts, the one that makes shadows dance on the walls of our minds, still flickers with the same irresistible glow. There's something primal about hearing a story aloud, the way a voice can tremble with sorrow or crackle with excitement, carrying emotions no parchment or screen ever could. When a medieval bard leaned in close, his words weren't just sounds. They were vibrations in the air, syncing with the listener's heartbeats. This wasn't just entertainment, it was neural alchemy. Scientists now know that hearing a story spoken triggers mirror neurons in our brains, making us feel the tale as if we're living it. A knight's triumph sends a rush of dopamine, a lover's betrayal tightens our chests, all without moving an inch. Text on a page might inform, but a voice transforms. That intimacy forged in taverns wasn't accidental. Unlike solitary reading, oral storytelling is a team sport. Every gasp, chuckle, or muttered curse from the crowd ripples back to the teller, shaping the next twist. It's why podcasts today feel like eavesdropping on a conversation. The best hosts speak as if they're across from you at a table, not behind a microphone. Medieval villagers knew this instinctively. A mother's lullaby, a gossip's whispered scandal, a bard's rousing chant. Each was tailored to the listener's reactions, live and unscripted. The human voice doesn't just deliver a story, it dances with the audience, adapting to their energy like fire to wind. And oh, the power of silence. A skilled storyteller knew when to let the room breathe, pausing just before the dragon's reveal, or leaving a lover's fate hanging in the air like smoke. Those gaps weren't empty, they were invitations for the audience to lean in, to participate. modern audiobook narrators use the same trick, letting a sentence linger so you can taste the tension. It's why horror podcasts terrify us more than horror novels. The creak of a floorboard or the hitch in the narrator's breath worms deeper into our psyche than typed words ever could. This isn't nostalgia, it's biology. Our brains are wired to prioritize human voices. Infants recognize their mother's speech before they understand words. Prisoners in isolation cling to radio hosts like lifelines. Even in our age of screens, podcasts and voice notes are exploding, not because they're convenient, but because they satisfy a hunger older than writing itself. The Tavern's torch has passed to AirPods and car stereos, but the flame is the same. We crave stories that don't just speak to us, but through us, vibrating in our bones like a minstrel's last resonant chord. That moment when a Netflix series ends on a shocking twist, leaving you desperate to click next episode, you can thank medieval storytellers for that. The cliffhanger, that delicious agony of unresolved suspense, wasn't invented by streaming platforms. Picture a tavern bard abruptly stopping his tale mid-sentence as the hero dangles over a pit of snakes, tossing his hat on the floor for coins before continuing. That wasn't just panhandling, it was mastery of human psychology. Our brains hate unfinished business, clinging to unresolved plots like burrs on fabric. Medieval performers exploited this flaw brilliantly, turning curiosity into coin, and today's showrunners do the same with season finales that spark endless fan theories. But cliffhangers are just one trick in a much older playbook. Take the hook, that irresistible opening line that reels us in. A medieval bard might begin with, "Listen close, for what I'll tell you chilled the blood of kings," while a modern thriller writer opts for, "The last thing she remembered was the scream, and it wasn't hers." Both exploit the same neural trigger, our insatiable need to resolve mystery. Our ancestors survived by solving puzzles. Was that rustling leaves or a predator? And stories tap into that primal itch. Whether it's a podcast host teasing a scandal or a YouTuber screaming, "Wait till you see this," the DNA of those tavern openings lives on. Then there's the three-act structure, often treated as some sacred Hollywood rule. Long before screenwriting gurus codified it, oral storytellers instinctively divided tales into setup, confrontation, and resolution. A medieval romance might open with a knight's humble beginnings, Act 1, plunge him into a dragon battle, Act 2, and crown him king, Act 3. This rhythm mirrors our lived experience: birth, struggle, triumph, which is why it still dominates everything from TD Talks to TikTok soap operas. Even children's bedtime stories unconsciously follow this arc because our brains crave the symmetry of challenge and payoff. Character archetypes, too, are eerily consistent across centuries. The tavern trickster who outsmarts the pompous lord, that's the ancestor of every sitcom's wisecracking sidekick. The virtuous maiden rescuing herself with wit instead of waiting for a knight. She's reborn in modern heroines, from detective novels to video games. These molds endure because they reflect universal human dynamics: power, rebellion, redemption, that transcend era or medium. Perhaps the most ingenious medieval technique was modular storytelling. Minstrels didn't memorize entire epics word for word. They mastered interchangeable scenes they could slot in or out based on audience mood. Sound familiar? Today's TV writers call it the monster of the week format, where standalone episodes fit into a larger arc. Video games use it too, with side quests that flesh out lore without derailing the main plot. This flexibility, born from necessity in ale-soaked rooms, became a blueprint for nonlinear narratives in everything from choose-your-own-adventure shows to open-world RPGs. Yet for all these shared tools, one element remains timeless: the human touch. medieval storytellers adjusted tales in real time based on crowd reactions, lengthening a love scene if sighs filled the room, skipping battles if yawns spread. Modern creators might use analytics instead of hecklers, but the goal is identical: to forge a connection that feels personal, immediate, alive. Whether through a bard's improvised verse or an algorithm serving personalized content, the heart of storytelling hasn't changed. Only the hearth has from crackling firelight to the cool glow of screens, still drawing us close to hear what happens next. Consider the epic of Beowulf, a tale so gripping it survived over 1,000 years without the crutch of parchment. Originally sung in mead halls by firelight, this story of a warrior battling monsters didn't endure because of fancy language, but because it pulsed with primal truths. The fear of the unknown, embodied by Grendel lurking in the shadows, the weight of leadership as Beowulf ages from brash hero to weary king, even the melancholy ending where a funeral pyre burns bright against the inevitability of time. These aren't just plot points. They're emotional anchors that resonate as deeply today as they did when listeners first leaned in, their faces lit by flames. Fast forward to modern cinema, and you'll spot Beowulf's DNA in every superhero saga where a flawed protagonist stares down darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Then there's Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the medieval equivalent of a road trip podcast. What began as tavern banter, pilgrims trading stories to pass the miles, became a literary masterpiece precisely because it mirrored life's messy vibrancy. The raunchy Miller's Tale, with its love triangle and misplaced kisses, could easily be a modern rom-com. The Knight's lofty romance, that's your big-budget fantasy series right there. But Chaucer's genius was in his kaleidoscope of voices, noble and vulgar, sacred and profane, all jostling together like strangers at a bustling inn. Sound familiar? It's the same cacophony of perspectives that fuels today's anthology, shows or viral social media threads where everyone shares their version of the truth. But no medieval export has infiltrated modern culture quite like the Arthurian legends. These stories were the ultimate tavern remix, passed down, embellished, and reshaped by countless tellers before Malory penned Le Morte d'Arthur. The love triangle of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot wasn't just scandal. It explored the tension between duty and desire, a theme that fuels everything from political dramas to reality TV. Merlin's prophecies, they're the ancient blueprint for every chosen one narrative, from Star Wars to Harry Potter. Even the Holy Grail quest endures as a metaphor for unattainable goals, whether it's a startup chasing unicorn status or a filmmaker obsessed with the perfect shot. What's fascinating is how these tales mutated across mediums while keeping their core intact. A knight's code of honor in a 14th century ballad becomes Tony Stark's sacrificial arc in Avengers Endgame. The wife of Bath's fiery monologue about female agency finds echoes in Bridgerton's scheming heroines. These stories survived not because they were frozen in ink, but because they were alive, adaptable enough to fit new eras while still answering ancient human yearnings. A minstrel singing of Excalibur and a kid binge-watching Merlin on Netflix are part of the same unbroken chain, linked by the thrill of a story that feels both epic and intimate. The real proof of their legacy, we don't even recognize them as medieval anymore. When a video game casts you as a monster-slaying witcher, you're walking in Beowulf's footprints. When a political thriller pits idealism against betrayal, it's Camelot's ruins whispering in the script. These tales didn't just influence art, they rewired our collective imagination, turning archetypes into instincts. So next time you lose yourself in a fantasy novel or gasp at a movie twist, remember, you're not just being entertained, you're keeping alive a tradition that once thrived in torchlit rooms, where every telling added another stitch to the vast tapestry of story, stretching from then to now and onward. Want to hold a room spellbound like a medieval bard? It all begins with the hook, that first line that snaps listeners to attention. Picture a minstrel strumming his lute and declaring, "This is the tale of how I died and why you'll wish you'd been there to see it." In an instant, every ear in the tavern belongs to him. Modern storytellers can steal this move, open with a contradiction, a bold claim, or a question that prickles curiosity. A podcaster might begin, "The man who stole the Mona Lisa did it for the dumbest reason imaginable." A best-selling memoir kicks off with, "I was born twice, first as a baby, then as a corpse." These aren't just first lines, they're fishing hooks, and audiences are helpless against the tug. But grabbing attention is only the first step. Medieval bards knew the power of sensory immersion long before virtual reality. They didn't just describe a dragon, they let you smell its sulphurous breath, feel the tremors of its footsteps, hear the creak of armor as the knight raised his sword. Today's equivalent, the true crime narrator who doesn't just say the house was quiet, but paints the scene. The only sound was the fridge humming in the kitchen, its door slightly ajar, spilling a sliver of light onto the blood-stained linoleum. Details aren't decoration, they're portals. Whether you're recounting a vacation mishap or pitching a startup, specifics transform listeners from spectators to participants, walking beside you in the story's world. Now, the heartbeat of any great tale, rhythm. A bard's voice was his instrument, rising to a fever pitch during battles, dropping to a whisper for secrets, pausing just long enough to make the crowd lean in. Modern speakers often forget this dynamism, delivering stories in monotone like grocery lists. Watch a stand-up comic masterclass. The best ones don't just tell jokes, they orchestrate them, speeding through setup, slowing for the punchline, letting silence do half the work. Even in writing, rhythm thrums beneath the surface. Short, staccato sentences quicken the pulse during a chase scene. Languid, flowing prose mirrors a lover's sigh. The medieval rule still applies. If your voice doesn't dance, neither will your audience's hearts. Here's where many storytellers falter. They forget the crowd isn't just listening, they're collaborating. Tavern tales thrived on participation, gasps, heckles, demands for embellishment. Modern audiences crave the same role. A campfire ghost story grows scarier when the teller suddenly asks, "What was that sound behind you?" A business presentation lands harder when the speaker pauses to ask, "How many of you have faced this problem?" This isn't about gimmicks, it's about recognizing that stories aren't monologues. They're conversations where half the words hang unspoken in the air, waiting for the listener's imagination to breathe them to life. And finally, the close, not a fizzle, but a detonation. Medieval bards didn't trail off with "anyway, that's what happened." They left audiences reeling with a twist, a moral, or an image that lingered like smoke. A saga about a knight's quest might end with his sword rusting in a field, now just a perch for crows. A modern example, the documentary that concludes not with facts, but with the subject's haunting last journal entry. If they find this, tell them I wasn't afraid, just curious. Great endings resonate because they don't tie bows. They leave doors ajar, inviting the audience to step through and wander the story's aftermath long after the telling ends. The truth is, we've never stopped being those wide-eyed villagers huddled in the tavern. Our screens and headphones are just new campfires. Master these ancient techniques: hook, texture, rhythm, collaboration, echo, and you'll do more than tell stories. You'll cast spells. A wandering bard in the Middle Ages didn't just carry stories, he carried currency. In a world where most couldn't read or write, the ability to spin a gripping tale meant the difference between sleeping in a warm inn or shivering in a ditch. A minstrel might trade a bawdy joke for a hot meal, a heroic ballad for a night's shelter, or a flattering epic about a local lord's ancestry for a purse of coins. Storytellers were walking Swiss Army knives of survival, part journalist, part therapist, part rebel. Their words as essential to village life as the blacksmith's hammer or the baker's oven. This wasn't mere entertainment economics, it was evolutionary adaptation. Consider the traveling monk who memorized entire genealogies of noble families, trading his knowledge for protection on dangerous roads. Or the retired soldier who exaggerated his battlefield exploits just enough to earn free ale at the tavern, his stories serving as both pension and protection, since no one would rob a man rumored to have single-handedly slain 20 foes. Even the lowliest peasant telling ghost stories by the fire gained social capital, becoming the keeper of communal memory and the weaver of collective identity. Fast forward to today's boardrooms and classrooms, and the same rules apply, just with fewer loots. A startup founder pitching investors isn't reciting dry facts. She's telling the story of a problem so visceral you can feel it, a solution so elegant it seems inevitable. Teachers don't list historical dates. They recreate the tension in the room when treaties were signed, making students lean forward as if they might overhear the whispers of kings. Even doctors use narrative techniques, framing treatment plans as heroic journeys where the patient overcomes obstacles with courage and expert guidance. The tools have modernized, but the core transaction remains unchanged. Instead of singing for supper, a LinkedIn influencer crafts viral posts that land consulting gigs. Podcasters trade gripping true crime episodes for Patreon subscriptions, just as medieval bards offered serialized sagas for recurring patronage. Politicians don't recite policy papers, they tell stories about struggling families, framing themselves as the wise mentor who can guide the nation toward a happier ending. What's fascinating is how this ancient skill set maps onto modern survival metrics. Studies show job candidates who weave achievements into narratives get hired faster. Sales teams trained in storytelling outsell competitors by staggering margins. Leaders who share vulnerable personal stories inspire more loyalty than those spouting corporate jargon. It turns out our medieval ancestors were onto something profound. In a world drowning in information, the human brain still craves meaning wrapped in narrative, whether delivered by firelight or PowerPoint. The through line is clearer when you spot storytellers thriving in crises. During blackouts, neighbors sharing tales by candlelight recreate the tavern's communal comfort. Refugees preserving their culture through oral histories become the bards of displacement. Even in our digital age, when systems fail, whether power grids or social media platforms, we instinctively revert to the oldest networking tool we have: face-to-face stories that inform, connect, and sustain. The minstrel's lute may be obsolete, but his job description, translator of human experience, remains one of the few professions that will never be automated. Because when the chips are down, people don't remember spreadsheets or bullet points. They remember the story of how someone like them faced the darkness and found a way through. The printing press didn't just mass-produce books, it quietly threatened to extinguish a flame that had burned for millennia. As inked pages spread across Europe, the once irreplaceable storyteller found themselves edged out by something unprecedented: stories that didn't need a human voice to breathe. A tavern bard's epic, once a living thing shaped by each audience's gasps, could now be frozen in type, identical in Paris or Prague. And yet, for all its efficiency, something vital was lost in that translation. The warmth of a shared breath as a tale reached its climax, the collective groan when a villain triumphed. These couldn't be pressed between pages. Oral tradition didn't die overnight, but it faded into the background, becoming the murmur beneath the shout of mass media. Then came radio and television, turning storytelling into a one-way street. Suddenly, millions could hear the same polished narrative at once, but they couldn't shout back, couldn't demand the hero's sword swing differently. The tavern's democratic chaos gave way to passive consumption. Yet even here, echoes of the old ways persisted. Radio dramas like The War of the Worlds proved voices alone could still spark mass hysteria, just as medieval bards had stirred crowds to fury or tears. Around campfires and at sleepovers, kids kept the oral tradition alive with ghost stories, instinctively modulating their voices for maximum terror. The human need to speak and be heard never truly vanished. It just waited for its moment to reignite. That moment arrived with the rise of live storytelling movements like the Moth, where ordinary people step onto stages to share unscripted slices of their lives. Listen to a Moth champion describe losing their wedding ring at sea, and you'll hear the same cadences a medieval minstrel used: the pregnant pauses, the sudden bursts of laughter, the raw vulnerability that pulls strangers into kinship. These events aren't quaint nostalgia. They're proof that no algorithm can replicate the electricity of a story unfolding in real time, shaped by the teller's trembling hands and the audience's collective inhale. It's the tavern reborn, with microphones replacing lutes and cocktails standing in for ale, but the alchemy remains unchanged. Podcasting, though, might be oral tradition's most revolutionary reinvention. A solo host whispering true crime into your ear at midnight taps into the same primal intimacy as a bard huddled close with his listeners. The difference. That voice now travels across continents, reaching millions while still feeling like a secret shared just with you. Serialized podcasts with their cliffhangers and callbacks mirror the episodic sagas medieval crowds demanded over successive nights. Even the interactive nature of modern storytelling, listeners tweeting corrections, suggesting twists, echoes the hecklers and collaborators of old. What's truly remarkable is how these revivals highlight what was missing in the age of print and screens: the imperfect human pulse of unpolished narrative. A Moth storyteller forgetting their next line isn't a flaw. It's a reminder that this story is alive, happening right now. A podcaster's voice breaking with emotion doesn't get edited out. It becomes the hook that makes thousands lean closer. These aren't just entertainment formats, they're corrections to centuries of over-polished, distant storytelling. They remind us that the magic was never in the perfection of the tale, but in the shared breath between teller and listener, the space where a story stops being words and becomes an experience. So the next time you lose yourself in a live storytelling podcast or find tears welling at a friend's wedding toast, recognize the ancient lineage you're part of. The printing press couldn't kill oral tradition, and neither will holograms or AI, because no matter how slick our technology becomes, we'll always crave the oldest connection of all, one human voice, unadorned and unfiltered, reminding us that stories aren't meant to be consumed. They're meant to be lived together. Across the African savannah, the griot's voice rose and fell like the wind, his words weaving genealogies and battles into a tapestry of living history. Where European bards sang of knights and dragons, griots held entire empires in their memories, kings' names, treaties, droughts, passing them down through generations with rhythmic precision. This wasn't mere entertainment, it was a sacred duty, earning griots roles as advisors to rulers. A single family might guard a kingdom's stories for centuries, their voices the thread connecting past to present. Yet unlike medieval tavern tales where embellishment was celebrated, griots prized accuracy above all. To alter a detail was to risk erasing our ancestors' legacy. Meanwhile, in the icy vastness of the Arctic, Inuit shamans spun stories not with harps or drums, but with the crackle of fire and the crunch of snow underfoot. Their tales of Sedna, the vengeful sea goddess, or the trickster raven weren't just myths, they were survival manuals disguised as folklore. A child hearing how Sedna's severed fingers became seals understood where food came from. A hunter recounting the raven's mischief learned caution through laughter. Unlike European bards performing for coins, shamans blurred the line between storyteller and priest, their narratives invoking spirits to heal, predict, or teach. The stories lived in the land itself, whispered by wind or glimpsed in the aurora's dance. Journey to ancient India, and you'd find epic poets reciting the Mahabharata, not in hours but over weeks. This wasn't a solo performance. Entire villages gathered as narrators and audiences became collaborators, shouting corrections or demanding favorite episodes. Unlike the linear arcs of Western legends, Indian epics spiraled like lotus petals, with stories nesting within stories. A hero's journey might pause for a parable about a fish's wisdom, which itself contained a riddle about the nature of time. The audience didn't just listen, they wandered the narrative's labyrinth, discovering new meanings with each retelling. What unites these traditions isn't just the act of storytelling, but its sacred urgency. Norse skalds believed poetry was stolen from the gods by Odin, who hung 9 nights on the world tree to claim it. Australian Aboriginal songlines mapped geography and lore through melody, turning landscapes into mnemonics. While medieval taverns focused on communal joy, other cultures wove stories into the fabric of identity itself. A map, a courtroom, a scripture. Yet for all their differences, a universal grammar emerges. The call and response of West African griots mirrors the tavern bard's crowd work. The shaman's cautionary tales share DNA with Aesop's fables, and that moment when a Mahabharata reciter locks eyes with a child, adjusting the tale to watch them gasp. That's the same spark that lit 1,000 campfires, from the Rhine to the Niger, the unshakable truth that stories don't just belong to the teller. They live in the space between voices, handed down like torches, each flame shaped by the hands that carry it. Medieval storytellers didn't just entertain, they were the original teachers, turning lessons into lifelines through the power of narrative. Picture a mother in a thatched cottage spinning a fable about ants storing food for winter while her children nibbled crusts of bread. Or a traveling monk using the parable of the Good Samaritan to teach both Latin and compassion to village boys. These weren't just stories, they were survival kits disguised as entertainment, embedding history, ethics, and practical wisdom into minds too young or illiterate for scrolls. A tale about a knight's chivalry taught boys how to behave. A witch's curse illustrated the dangers of straying into forbidden forests. The classroom was wherever people gathered, and the curriculum was written in adventure, humor, and dread. Fast forward to today's 3rd grade math lesson, where a teacher transforms fractions into a pirate's treasure map, each correct answer revealing another step toward buried gold. Or a corporate trainer explaining cybersecurity through a gripping saga about a hacker dubbed the Phantom Fisher. The tools have changed, but the instinct remains identical. Wrap knowledge in narrative and it sticks like glue. Studies show students retain up to 70% more information when taught through stories versus rote memorization. That's not a new discovery. It's a rediscovery of what medieval bards knew instinctively. Our brains are wired to prioritize information framed as conflict, resolution, and emotion. A list of Viking conquests might blur together, but the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok escaping a snake pit. That lodges in memory with claws. What's fascinating is how storytelling bridges the gap between abstract concepts and lived experience. A physics professor explaining relativity might ditch the equations momentarily to describe a hypothetical train ride where time slows down, a thought experiment Einstein himself used. Medical schools now employ narrative medicine, where students dissect patient stories to build empathy alongside anatomical knowledge. Even coding boot camps teach algorithms through interactive fables where variables become characters battling bugs in a digital realm. This isn't dumbing down, it's tapping into an ancient cognitive shortcut. Just as medieval villagers learned crop rotation from tales of foolish farmers who starved, modern learners absorb complex systems through metaphor and analogy. The most revolutionary shift, though, is the democratization of educational storytelling. In the Middle Ages, you needed a bard's vocal prowess to hold attention. Today, a kindergarten teacher with a picture book, a YouTuber animating history with stick figures, or a nurse using a doll to explain surgery to a child all harness the same power. The classroom as tavern metaphor extends beyond physical spaces. Think of TD Ed's animated lessons, where millions gather digitally to hear tales of scientific breakthroughs like modern-day villagers leaning in for a saga. The communal aspect remains vital, too. Group discussions about a novel's themes mirror the tavern debates over a bard's tragic ending, proving comprehension thrives in collaboration. Yet some educators still resist storytelling as frivolous, clinging to bullet points and standardized tests. They're missing what medieval scholars understood. Facts without context are like unlit torches present but useless in the dark. When a literature professor compares Gatsby's green light to the allure of social media validation, or a chemistry teacher frames electron bonds as atomic friendships, they're not just teaching, they're igniting curiosity. The best educational stories don't just convey information, they leave doors ajar, inviting learners to step through and explore further. That's the true inheritance of those medieval taverns, not just the stories themselves, but the sparks they struck in minds hungry to understand their world, one unforgettable tale at a time. The flicker of virtual campfires may replace tavern hearths, but the dance between storyteller and listener remains unchanged. Imagine strapping on a VR headset and finding yourself transported not just visually, but viscerally, standing shoulder to shoulder with digital companions as a master narrator weaves a tale around you. The air hums with the scent of pine despite your physical room smelling of coffee, your palms growing clammy as the story's phantom wind chills your skin. This isn't science fiction. It's the logical extension of what medieval bards achieved with nothing but words and gestures: total sensory immersion. The tools have evolved from lute strings to haptic feedback gloves, but the goal is identical: to make the audience forget their audience at all, to transform them into participants breathing the same imagined air. Already, experimental theater groups are blending AI with ancient storytelling techniques. In one cutting-edge production, an interactive algorithm adjusts the plot in real time based on audience biometrics, heart rates, facial expressions, even subtle shifts in posture. If sensors detect collective tension during a heist scene, the AI extends the suspense. If engagement wanes during exposition, it triggers a sudden dragon attack. This might sound futuristic until you realize it's simply automating what skilled minstrels did instinctively, reading a room's energy and adapting on the fly. The tavern's call and response tradition has gone algorithmic, with neural networks replacing the drunk farmer who once shouted, "Make the hero lose a hand." Yet for all the dazzling tech, the stories that resonate follow the same archetypes honed over millennia. A groundbreaking analysis of successful VR narratives found that 89% use plot structures identifiable in medieval folklore: the hero's journey, the trickster's redemption, the impossible quest. Even in 360-degree environments where viewers can look anywhere, they consistently focus on the storyteller's virtual face during emotional beats, just as tavern crowds once hung on a bard's every grimace. Our brains remain wired for the familiar rhythm of setup, conflict, and resolution, whether delivered by a campfire or a hologram. The true revolution lies in accessibility. Where medieval storytelling required physical presence, AI-powered platforms now enable bedridden patients to gather in digital taverns where their eye movements guide interactive fables. Voice synthesis lets oral traditions survive beyond the lifespan of their human carriers. An Irish Sinchai's lilting brogue, preserved to tell tales to great-great-grandchildren they'll never meet. These aren't replacements for human connection but amplifiers of it, extending storytelling's reach while preserving its soul. What never changes is the hunger at storytelling's core. An AI can generate a technically perfect fairy tale, 3 acts, symbolic imagery, twist ending, but without the messy humanity of lived experience, it rings hollow. The most popular synthetic storytellers today are hybrid creatures, human writers seeding narratives with emotional truth, then unleashing algorithms to customize details for each listener. Like a medieval scribe illuminating parchment, we're learning to work alongside our creations, not be replaced by them. The future belongs to storytellers who honor this balance, who wield technology like a minstrel's lute, not as the song itself, but as the instrument that makes the song soar. They'll craft tales where augmented reality overlays let you chase ghosts through your own neighborhood, or where biofeedback adapts a horror story to your exact tolerance for terror. But beneath the silicon and code, the essentials endure: a voice in the darkness, a circle of eager faces, and the timeless magic that happens when imagination catches fire and spreads from mind to mind. However we tell stories in the centuries to come, they'll still answer the same primal needs that once drew villagers to the tavern's glow: to feel less alone, to make sense of chaos, and to believe, if only for a night, in wonders beyond the visible world. From the flickering torchlight of medieval taverns to the blue glow of smartphone screens, the essence of storytelling remains unbroken, an unshakable bridge across 800 years of human connection. Those long-ago bards would scarcely recognize our streaming services and podcasts, yet they'd feel instantly at home with how we lean in when a tale takes hold, how laughter still ripples through a room at the perfect punchline, how silence falls when suspense tightens its grip. The tools have transformed beyond recognition, but the alchemy, that's eternal. A child whispering ghost stories at a sleepover, a comedian roasting societal norms on stage, a grandma recounting her youth to wide-eyed grandchildren. Each is channeling the same primal energy that once held ale-soaked villagers spellbound. What's remarkable isn't just that these techniques survived, but how they've thrived in alien landscapes. The cliffhanger that kept medieval crowds returning for serialized sagas now fuels Netflix binge watches. The call and response chants of tavern ballads live on in viral TikTok duets. Even the communal world-building of ancient epics finds new life in collaborative platforms like Wikipedia or open-source gaming mods, where thousands collectively shape narratives across continents. The methods may be digital, but the heartbeat remains analog, a testament to storytelling's role not as mere entertainment, but as the operating system of human connection. Yet for all our technological leaps, something profound emerges when we strip away the gadgets, gather people around actual firelight today, and watch how bodies instinctively arrange themselves in that same half-circle, how voices drop to that familiar conspiratorial hush. Neuroscientists confirm what bards knew instinctively. Stories told aloud synchronize listeners' brainwaves in ways screens never can. It's why podcasters obsess over audio intimacy, why audiobook sales skyrocket despite e-readers existing. We crave the vibration of a human voice carrying emotion directly to our nervous systems, unchanged since the first spoken tales echoed through caves. This legacy asks something of us too. In an age where algorithms feed us passive content, we're invited to reclaim our birthright as storytellers, not just consumers. The medieval village didn't outsource its narratives to professionals. Every farmer, blacksmith, and midwife had tales to share. Your family's immigration story, that hilarious disaster of a first date, the quiet moment that changed your perspective, these aren't just memories. They're modern-day folktales waiting to be shaped and shared, whether over dinner tables, social media, or letters to future generations. The true magic was never in the teller's eloquence, but in the courage to say, "Let me tell you what happened," and the generosity of those who lean closer to listen. So as the digital age accelerates, let's carry forward not just the techniques of those medieval storytellers, but their spirit. The next time you lose yourself in a video game's lore or dissect a movie plot with friends, recognize the unbroken thread connecting you to ancestors who saw their lives reflected in firelit sagas. Stories were never just escapes, they're how we've always made sense of chaos, passed down wisdom, and whispered across time. You're not alone. The tavern's doors may be closed, but its hearth still burns wherever voices gather to say, "Once upon a time," and mean,